Okay. If you have your text with you, go ahead and take that out and turn to, let's see, Sweet 9, the Divine Comedy. Actually, let's turn and look at the map on page 1599. I'm going to do that first. This is an excellent visual, and that honestly I refer back to over and over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and do a roll, and then I'll turn it around. Sean, here. Chancey, here. Jonathan, here. Connor, Sarah, here. Kelsey, here. Malia, here. Shara, Char. Rebecca, here. Mercedes, Abigail, Jared, here. Harris, here. Amberly, Marcus, here. Ned, Fee, Mark, here. And Trey. Here. If y'all will, just sign in, please. And if you do, Lord. Yes. I do want to change it. I'm afraid to. No, don't click on that. Oh, it's because, don't you think that looks like it? I mean, when you picture it, I really do think this one is very much, at least from Dante's version, this is what I picture. What's that? Mm-hmm. As you go on down to the very bottom, remember the very bottom, well, I don't know if you know this, the very bottom of hell is actually a frozen lake. Yeah. So is that from church or is that from the Inferno?
That's from the Inferno.
Yeah. All right. So as you look at page 1599, this I constantly go back and forth. Now I can't tell you to make a photocopy of that because that's copyright and all of that, but that would be really nice if, as you were reading through, to have that out the side just to keep the organization going in your mind. So just a little bit of background on Dante. Of course, if you've been reading through, you can tell that lots of people from Florence are there, right? He really incorporates what I consider to be kind of the bad guys, his political enemies. He has placed them in the concept of hell itself. So those names don't mean much to us, but during that time period, it would have really been a scandal for those names to be there. And other names are there because he's actually trying to restore reputation. We see that in a couple of the cantos as well, and a couple of the sins. He wants to bring back, or at least to point out some of their good points, you know, their good characteristics, their moral characteristics. During this time, I mentioned that political enemies, there was a huge divide between if there was going to be the head of government would be the same as the Pope would be the head of state. So the head of state and the head of church would be the Pope. Then there was another faction that said, no, those two things should be separated, and that's what we have. And no, our government is separated from religion. He was on the side of separation. Sir?
You said it's in sign in the paper.
We'll get you. But Dante was on the side of separation of church and state. So when we think about his ideologies, we see him separating those. And that's kind of the basis for separating moral conduct. You're either walking with God or you have gone astray. You're lost from God. While he was writing the Inferno, he was actually exiled from Florence, and he was never allowed to return. So as he took a trip, his wife, his children remained there. Kind of says something about his marriage, and he speaks to marriages as well. So he was really isolated, and you think if you're isolated from the city that you love, and he loved Florence, and he wanted the best for the city, it was very much kind of a knife in his heart, never to be allowed to return. And I read not too long ago, I believe it was like 2008, finally the city council of Florence pardoned him for whatever crime he had been accused. So in this 2008, and it was like a split vote. It was like 20-5 or something against, or no, for. So there was still that holdout. And the commentary was, it actually comes down from the government and the division of the families from way back during the 1600s, whatever. So it's just interesting background. Okay. Structure. If you notice, actually the entire Divine Comedy is written in Italian, very much like Decameron. So it was written for the common man. And as we read it, and it is so dense, it's hard to believe the common man would be reading this, but they were. Note the number 3 throughout. There are 3 sections of the Divine Comedy. Just the Inferno is the first one, and that's the descent into hell. That's the one we read. But there's also Purgatoria and Paradiso. So paradise then, of course, is heaven. And in the Catholic conception, purgatory is where you can go, you haven't quite made it to heaven, but people can pray for you, atone for your sins, and then, if you're lucky, you can rise into heaven or Paradiso. Now, another level of 3 is here in hell itself. We start with the 3 levels, or the 3 main circles of hell, and then within those circles there are other circles. So we start this layering process. And then I pointed to the map on page 1599. And really think of it as a map. It is a map of him traveling down on this journey through hell. So it's literally a step-by-step progression of what he has to do, where all he has to travel. Let's see. I spoke last week about the structure with the Decameron, and in this one as well, we have 33 cantos, and the Inferno has the introduction, which actually means that it has 34. So what we wind up with then is 100 cantos in its totality. But we're only reading the first 34. Y'all thank me for that, right? Just Inferno. This is a term that you should remember, especially for exams, and that is terzarama. This was actually created by Dante. It's the 3-line rhyme scheme. And if you'll go ahead and turn to, you will see 1600, just the first page. It starts out immediately, and then you have those 3-line stanzas throughout every single canto. Now, what's amazing about this, and I can't, when we think about Dante the writer and a creative genius, every single line is 11 syllables. So you've got 33 syllables in each stanza, and you've got 33 cantos. So this number 3, definitely know that. It just repeats itself over and over and over again in the design structure of the actual poem. Epic poem, right?
Yeah.
Yes, it is an epic. So structure-wise, we think about an allegory. Literally every single thing in the Divine Comedy, especially in the Inferno, represents something outside of itself. Now, the title is the Divine Comedy, but it's not comedy in how we think of it now. During the time period, there were histories, there were tragedies, and there were comedies. A comedy was simply a piece that had an ending that was successful. There was no tragic twist at the end. So everything comes out okay. So from the beginning, simply from the title, the reader would have known that Dante does ascend to Paradiso. He does make it through the Inferno. So Dante as he travels through is Dante the Pilgrim. So if you think of the Crusades and the pilgrims on their journey, this is, representing that. Now, he is a sinner. At the opening, in the introduction, he is lost in the dark wood. So he is away from the path of God. Somewhere along the way, he has gotten off track and he has become a sinner. And he can't find his way back. So he is representative of all sinners throughout. Then he encounters, early in the introduction, Virgil. Now, Virgil, as part of, as the writer, the historic Roman writer of the Aeneid, his hero, Aeneas, who would be the parallel. We read the Odyssey, so those parallels would be Homer as the author, and then, of course, Odysseus as the hero himself. So those are kind of the parallels of what's going on. Within all of this, Virgil was known not only for the sense of reason, the voice of reason, and logic, but he was considered to be one of the epic teachers of the time. So Virgil then becomes Dante's teacher in getting him through the Inferno. So he's teaching him lessons, and while the journey is part of his recovery or coming back to God, learning from Virgil is also a very important component to that renewal, the discovery of his path back. Now, I need a lot of visual as I'm reading the Inferno. As I said, it's dense and it can be very confusing. What I did here was just to remind you that Dante's vision of hell is his creative literary vision. All right? So what I have there is how he sees it. Now, he sees sin as there are sins that aren't as bad as the others, right? So that top level, upper hell, is the sins of incontinence. And this is just where people did not have control of their desires. These are seen as lesser sins because no one was hurt other than the person himself or herself. All right, so it's kind of like no harm, no foul, because it was just those people involved. It was a matter of choice in that respect, not to hurt others. The next layer is lower hell. Now, in lower hell, this is where we see the sins of violence, all right? And those would then be the sins against God, against self. That's where there are against others. It's where we see where harm was caused to someone else. And those are seen as sins that are deeper, that they are worse sins. And then we have the very bottom. So if you're thinking and creating this, huge hole down into the earth as Satan is kicked out of heaven, at the top, it's really big and wide, and you have a lot of people up through those levels, and then as it goes down, it narrows until we get to the very depths. And this isn't easily read, but these are sins of fraud. And with fraud, we're looking at deliberate deceit, and we're looking at deliberate betrayals. Now keep in mind that Satan then becomes the ultimate betrayer because of his betrayal against God. Any questions through here? Okay? So Canto 1, the introduction. We can define sin simply as the separation from God. What we see on 1600 in the actual introduction is that Dante the Pilgrim is lost in that dark wood. And he's trying to find his way out. He hasn't been paying attention to how he's been living, and it's kind of gotten away from him. very much like we said before, sometimes you're just putting one foot in front of the other, the day-to-day, going to work, going to class, and we lose sight of the big picture sometimes of what really our end goal is. So that's kind of where he is. He's just lost sight of the path, of the good chosen path. Then he sees a light at the top of a mountain, and he knows to go to the light, right? Because that light then would be coming from heaven. And he encounters roadblocks, and the first ones are animals. Now, if you noticed, in different levels of hell, there are guardians. These kind of mirror that, but it's in reverse order. He encounters the leopard, which represent the very depths then of hell as the fraudulent. He encounters a lion, violent. He's scared of that as well. But it's the she-wolf that actually stops him cold in his tracks. And he can't get around the she-wolf, who is really guarding that ascent. So he's literally frightened out of his mind. He doesn't know what to do, so he runs back then into the dark wood. Now, the dark wood, in that respect, is the place of safety, but at the same time, he's lost there. So he's lost not only geographically, but his soul is lost. He's wandering, literally. Looking on page 1602, at the very top of the page, line 65, he actually sees a shade. Now, the shades are the spirits. And as he sees that, he speaks directly to. Now, this turns out to actually be Virgil. And he says, "Have pity on my soul," I cried to him, "whichever you are, shade or living man." So note, he's disoriented. He's not exactly sure what's going on. Then he says, this is Virgil, "No longer living man, though once I was," he said. "My parents were from Lombardy. Both of them were Mantuans by birth." And then it continues on. He then starts, starting about line 82, this is where Dante truly implores, he's beseeching Virgil to help him. And he says, "O light and honor of the other poets, may my long years of study and that deep love that made me search your verses help me now." So he's pleading with him to get him out of there, to show him the light. And then he says, and this is the beginning of the teacher-student relationship. He says, "You are my teacher." And he point blank, addresses him in that manner. "The first of all my authors." So he's paying homage to him. He then calls the noble style that was to bring me honor. And a few lines down, about 91, we see that Virgil's response. Virgil tells him, "You cannot go straight up the mountain." And he says, line 91, "But you must journey down another road," he answered, when he saw me lost in tears. "If ever you hope to leave this wilderness, this beast, the one you cry about in fear, allows no soul to succeed along her path." So he point blank says, if that's the obstacle, you cannot go through it. You must find another way around it. On page 1603, he actually tells him that he accepts him as God, and then he tells him why. So Beatrice, who is actually the true love of Dante, symbolically, she is pure love in its finest. And as she is in Paradiso, she sees him lost in the wood, and her heart breaks. And she speaks to different people, and then the Virgin Mary actually sends Beatrice to Virgil And Virgil, after hearing Beatrice's plea to help Dante get back on the right path with God, then says yes to her. There's no way that he can deny her. She literally drives him to tears in that plea. Let's see. I think the journey begins. So let's look to Canto 2. Page 1604. The introduction is on the back, the summary that's in front of each one. So as their journey begins, of course, Dante is going to do what all epic poets have done before. He invokes the muses, just as we saw Homer do in the Odyssey. And he asks again for Virgil to guide him through. And as he's talking to Virgil, he then asks who's been there before, and he tells him. And he says, why me? Why am I allowed to go on this journey? How does that come about? Because he doesn't feel worthy. And the people that he's compared to is Aeneas and also Paul. So you can see that in lines 31 through 33 specifically. And he says, let's see, line 35, if you'll turn to that. He says, I fear it might turn out an act of folly. You are wise, and you see more than my words express. So note the self-doubt there with him. So he's full of doubt. He's off of the path of God. And while he's searching Virgil, he's also looking for kind of a restoration of confidence. He wants to be told that it's going to be okay. Lines 43, Virgil kind of has enough of all of that, with the self-doubt, with putting himself down, and he actually lashes out at Dante, and he calls him a coward. I'm going to delete that typo. And then he explains the reasons that he was sent to lead Dante through it. So if you look on page 1605, we have in lines 58 or so through 72 where Beatrice is giving the reasons for Virgil to lead him out. And that she loves Dante so much, and because she can't travel down, then she seeks his help in leading him out. Go down to lines 88. And here Beatrice says, a man must stand in fear of just those things that truly have the power to do us harm, of nothing else, for nothing else is fearsome. So when we think about the word courage, it's standing up, it's facing our fear, it's facing our harm. And here, the fear of going down and descending, and he's really kind of afraid of not making his way out to the other side.
Why does Virgil do this for her?
She pleads with him. She tells him how much she loves Dante. She also explains how he is a good man, but that he has lost the correct path and that he is away from God. And Virgil responds to that. And so he then agrees to go down, or actually to come up and to make the descent with him. Now, Virgil's done that a couple of times before, and we find that out much later in the Inferno. So this is not his first trip of taking someone through.
So he can just go between the two whenever he wants?
No, not whenever he wants. So he is given permission, and throughout the different circles, most of the circles have that guard that's part human, part animal, and oftentimes Virgil has to get control of that gatekeeper and say, we have permission from the highest being to do this. And he's kind of saying, you must step away. Okay. Let's move on through. With Canto 3, we actually then enter the vestibule. All right, so it's this outer opening that actually leads down into hell. And I need someone, Mark, you're a great reader. Would you read for me, please? Just the first 9 lines. So this is the inscription that literally is in stone above the gates of hell.
I am the way to the darkness city. I am the way into eternity. I am the way to a forsaken race. Justice it was that, and rule my great creator. Divine omnipotence created me, and highest wisdom joined with primal love, forming nothing eternal things. We were made, and I shall last eternally. Abandon every hope, all you who enter.
Look at that last line. So literally, Dante, as I think all of us would be, just quivering, shaking, right, in fear. And he is as well. So when you think about trusting, and even though Virgil is known, right, he's well known during the time period he's looked up to, Dante wants to emulate that, there's still trepidation. He's not sure. As they're standing there, he hears the wails, the crying, the yelling, the screams coming from below. And that reinforces his fear. He just kind of becomes more and more afraid. And Virgil, as the teacher, tries to reassure him. And I want us to read those lines. Let's see, about line 16, 15. He says, now here you must leave all distrust behind. So imagine someone telling you, you have to believe. You must believe in me. Let all your cowardice die on the spot. Now Dante is fearful, and his fear, it ebbs and flows throughout, but at this starting point, he's just very unsure. He can't get past it. He says, we are all at the place where earlier I said you could expect to see the suffering race of souls who lost the good of intellect. And then the reassurance comes in. Placing his hand on mine, smiling at me in such a way that I was reassured, he led me into those mysteries. And when I read that part, I really think of a parent to a child trying to reassure, and then that soothes and calms Dante. He begins to weep. So he feels all of this pity for the souls who are being punished. And we see that empathy in Dante all through the Inferno. Now that ebbs and flows depending upon the person. Remember, he had political enemies there. But we will see that time and again. So from the vestibule, we encounter the first group of people. So on page 1608, if you'll go to about line 34, it's just the third or fourth line down, we see those who are just running aimlessly, and wind is whipping about, and they're running after this banner that literally has nothing on it. It's completely blank. And these were the people who did not choose to be with God, but they didn't necessarily choose not to be. They were the undecideds. They were the ones who just kind of amped along. And because they did nothing in life, they chased nothing in death as their punishment. Now this brings in the term you want to know because we see it throughout the Inferno, and that's contrapasso. Now with contrapasso, we see one of two things. The punishment either resembles the sin and it's in a hellish way, or it's the opposite. It contrasts with the sin itself. So it can be that exaggeration in a negative, or it can be the opposite of what they did. Either one. We also see in about line 60 another group of people here. These were the hateful people. They are being stung and bitten by wasp hornets. If you'll look about line 65, he says, these wretches who had never truly lived went naked, and they were stung and stung again by the hornets and the wasps that circled them, and made their faces run with blood and streaks. Their blood, we get this first images of red that we get throughout, mixed with their tears, dripped to their feet, and the disgusting maggots collected in the pus. So you just get a sense of the horror. All right? And remember, we're just a few pages in. What's that? We haven't even started. We're not even in limbo yet. So we also meet, and let's see, page 1609, lines 88, we meet Karen. Now, he's one of the first boat stewards. And with each of the rivers, and the four rivers that we see in the Inferno, we see him a few times throughout. And as he comes in, he actually tells Dante his fate. If you'll look, let's see, lines 87, and then it goes down through about 93, 94. He says, another way by other ports not here. You shall pass to reach the other shore. A lighter skiff than this must carry you. So he actually tells Dante that he is going to make it out of the Inferno and that he will make it to Paradiso sooner or later. So he gives him that prophecy. It's whether or not Dante is listening carefully, and if that will embolden him, if that will give him courage and give him self-confidence to see his way through. Well, it doesn't. On page 1610, if you'll look, we have lines 130 through 135, and it reads, he finished speaking, and the grim terrain shook violently, kind of like an earthquake. And the fright it gave me, even now in recollection, makes me sweat. So even the mere memory of it. Out of the tear-drenched land a wind arose, and I kind of think hurricane or tornado style winds, which blasted forth into a reddish light, knocking my senses out of me completely. Now I'm going to say he actually faints there out of fear. You know, he's literally almost scared to death here. And he falls as one tired into sleep. Again, I think he faints. You think so, Paris? Thank you.
He does that more than once.
He does that several times throughout, and each time he's scared to death.
Yeah.
You know, and isn't there an animal that does that? It's a possum.
No, it's a goat.
Goats do it. But don't possums do it, or they just feign? They just fake it. But goats will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they'll stiffen up all over.
I should pull up one of those memes and do that as a comparison. So this is just another, page 1599, you have one of those, the mounts of the journey through. This is just another diagram of that. You can print it, that's probably going to ruin your ink, but
So is he actually protected from punishments like in hell?
Virgil acts as a protector, and they're, but they have to be reminded that he can't be hurt. So there are several places as you read through that you will see it looks as if they're in mortal danger. There's one in one of the later cantos that was for today. I can't remember exactly which one. But the angels outside of the city of Dis actually refuse entry, and then they have to they get help from heaven for another angel to come through. So there are different places where they are definitely try to be blocked, and those gatekeepers who want to hurt Dante. Now remember, he's the living soul, right? So he stands out like a sore thumb. You know, all of the gatekeepers, all of the shades, every single person in the Inferno, or every shade or spirit, gatekeeper, everyone can tell that he's living, and he doesn't belong there. So they are very much against him. They're very uncomfortable with his presence, to say the least. So we finally get to Circle 1, and Circle 1 is Limbo. Now this is where Virgil is. Virgil encourages Dante to ask questions, and he does that as well throughout. So I'm going to play Virgil. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes, sir. Yes. Any questions related to Dante? Okay. Please raise your hand if you need to. Just as a reminder, you know, he is the teacher. He is his guide back to the path of God. We see as they enter this first circle, and it is called Circle 1 Limbo, that there are sounds of sighs. And everyone who is in limbo they did not have the opportunity to know God. So these were virtuous pagans. These were our Homers. These were matrons of Rome. Thousands of people literally who were of high esteem, but were literally born before the time of Christ, so they never had the opportunity to know God. We see babies are mentioned here who die before they can know, before baptism. We see throughout in this canto as well that Virgil actually dies at about the same time as Jesus, is what I'm thinking. And as he goes, or he's been in the Inferno, he's been in limbo for a bit when Jesus dies and then makes the ascension. So the people from the Old Testament, the virtuous from the Old Testament, during the ascension, remember, Jesus comes down and he gathers and then he carries with him to heaven. So we see people like Rachel, Moses, who are some others? There are lots named, but you know, all of those prophets, King David, all of the virtuous from the Old Testament, they have ascended, so they're not there. 6:12 and 6:13 has more. One thing about the punishment, and I don't think it's true punishment for the pagans, for those who are in limbo, they just don't have any hope. So there is the light of God, they're aware of the light of God, but at the same time, they have no hope of reaching it. So when you think of hopelessness, you know, as punishment, where you know that you can't attain something that you would like to. So as a punishment, it's certainly not one that has a physical aspect to it. All of the others have a physical punishment as well. Let's go to Canto 5. Canto 5 begins on page 1614. Now Minos is the one who guards this circle. And, excuse me, Minos, as a king, actually set about a solid set of laws. It was a well-defined system of laws and government. So he is deemed to be someone who is of exceptional judgment. Now, in doing that, he has been appointed as kind of half man, half beast. He has like a serpent's tail or a serpent body and a tail of a scorpion. He wraps that tail around the person who is descending, and that determines which circle in hell the person will go to. So he plays a very important part, and his judgment is trusted. All right, so when we read through, we have to assume that this is in fact the level where they should be, that no one has been placed by mistake, so that their punishment does fit the sin. Now here we see the theme of sins and punishment truly established. The punishment is suited to the sin as well as to the severity of it. In different places, in some of the cantos, that was the assigned reading tonight, was the river of boiling blood, right? Some of those were not submerged, some were up to their eyeballs in it. And that depended upon the level of sin, the degree of sin which they committed. So this is where it truly starts, it's kind of solidified at the beginning. These are considered to be the sins of incontinence. So this is all in upper hell. And these were simply people who they lusted for something. They desired it. And the first ones that we see that Dante actually engages in and feels pity for again are those who were sins of lust, sins of desire, of love. He points to several famous characters, people. There is Dido, Cleopatra, there's Helen, there's Paris, and then the list goes on and on and on. And he gives us several, but there seems to be so many that are there. And Dante truly pities them, because what's happening to them, kind of as they were swept off their feet in life, they were kind of carried off by something, by an emotion or a desire. In this circle, they are actually being swept away by like this hurricane force wind. So the lovers that he actually speaks to, he calls out, is Francesca. And Francesca and her lover literally will get close to one another. It's kind of like Ode to a Grecian Urn, where they come very close to touching, but they never do. So their punishment is that closeness and then being ripped apart again by the winds. He feels tremendous pity for them. He sees it as these two, Francesca and her lover, they actually fall in love, but she is committing adultery. She has an affair with her husband's younger brother. And the affair begins innocently enough. They're reading literature. And remember, during a time period, in different time periods, all the way up into the 1800s, if you read for pleasure, it was a sin. It should have been didactic. It should have taught something. But in coming together and reading literature for pleasure, one thing leads to another until they finally commit adultery. When her husband discovers that, then he becomes one of the ultimate betrayers. He kills both of them on the spot. So while they're in circle 2, he is down in the depths because he committed harm against another. Any questions through there?
Tell us who the betrayer he killed.
He kills his brother and his wife. So he takes the life of others. The justification is irrelevant. Yep. Jonathan?
This probably isn't like too relevant, but so once you're in, the people are in hell, and like, for example, the people are like halfway in the boiling blood or whatever, are they there for eternity?
For eternity. There's no way to get out. You're there for eternity. You don't get to come up to different levels. Your punishment doesn't get worse. Your sin, your punishment equates to your sin, and it is eternal.
Well, see, that's
There's
the
no
thing,
hope.
though, because I feel like at some point, like the boiling, it wouldn't matter anymore. So the next millions of years, you're just sitting there like, oh, it hurts.
You think you get used to it?
Yeah,
But so it's like
Oh, in the
one
hot
of
tub.
them,
yeah.
one of them, like they get pushed down further. Like, I can't remember, it was the feet up in the air, and then every time somebody comes, you know what I'm talking
I
about?
do. That might be in the
Like, they go down.
sands, the burning sands maybe, or the flames come down
Yeah, where it touches the bottom
of their feet, yeah.
And but every time another one comes down, another soul is sent there, shade or whatever,
Uh-huh.
it pushes them deeper.
Into, so maybe their pain does become more.
That sucks.
I'm telling you, when you read the Inferno in depth, kind of checks a couple of things. I'm telling you, you might even could like skip church a time or two because this is so intense. I think we learn lessons as we go through the Inferno. At least what good literature is supposed to be about, and that is to make us think, to make us make decisions, to guide, but if nothing else, just critical thought about what we're reading and how it might apply even today. Paris?
Yeah, it's interesting because the fact that it kind of covers everything. So that's what that's kind of scary about it. Like, it's crazy how much thought you put some thought into it.
It's amazing, and that's what when we think about Dante. Now I get chill bumps, but because I'm the English teacher. But when you think about creative genius,
Yeah.
I don't think I have the brain capacity to get my head around it. That how in depth it is, the degree of detail, the thought, and not only that, but the touch points. Because in each of the circles and with different people, the reader feels that pity. It feels sympathy, empathy. You think, ooh, glad I didn't get caught. Glad I can repent. I still have that opportunity. And you even feel anger. You feel anger with him against some of those, or the frustration. Or sometimes he's even sanctimonious, where he's like, you're getting what you deserve. Yeah. And remember when we read, and one of the stories from the Decameron, remember the story of the two knights and the lady? And we talked about, which one, does your heart go out to? Which one do you think was really wronged? And did any of them truly get what they deserve? What are their punishments? Does their punishments then fit their crime? So it brings in some things, and that's why I wrote the pieces that we've read before. If we go back through those, where do those characters fall? What circles? What would be their crime? Where do you think they would be placed in the levels?
The lady would be, of course, the lust, of course.
Desire, yes, yeah.
They kind of
Sense of incontinence.
Francesca
And her knife, absolutely. Also think about, I was thinking A Lover's Prize. Remember the poem, the lyric there? And she's talking about the knight who has abandoned her. With that? And that's the Odyssey. With Antigone, think about, when we think about crimes against nature, crimes against God, crimes against other man, betraying government, crimes against the self, the suicides that were there. Remember, the king, Creon there, Antigone feels as if he is ignoring the laws of God. So that would be crimes against God, not allowing the burials.
What's crazy about it is Creon and Knight, they could actually repent though. When you think about it,
They still had the time, well, and they were pagans too. We have to consider that. So, that's a couple of different layers.
Right.
right? Or are they pagans and would just be in limbo? Or would you say that their crimes are against God, and that would be the entity equivalent? And I think that would...
But in antiquity, when she does like what God's want, and she would kill herself.
Yeah.
That's like really low in hell, so.
That gets down pretty low, and those are the ones that are the trees, right? Yeah. Think about the Cameron. Think about Ciparella. Remember him? The sinner. Remember the list of confessions?
They just have to put pieces of
Like literally.
They're like the Decameron Chainsaw Massacre and just place bits. We might be creating an extra level of hell here, somewhere in between. I think Dante would probably wind up putting him somewhere. Okay, let's go to circle 3, gluttony. Now, when we think about gluttony, that's an excess. You enjoy food or drink too much. I put wine, alcohol, but food and wine you enjoy too much. Is that the reason we go on diets? Is there some base instinct somewhere deep down that we know we're not supposed to? I don't know.
I always, like with me, I'm assuming gluttony was a sin anyway, so I kind of don't eat much I eat till I'm satisfied. So I don't kind of,
we need to talk later. I need to
I
need to get on that program.
So I don't eat much. Or I eat, but I eat my plate clean.
So you are a plate cleaner.
Yeah, I finished, but I'm not full. Like, I'm satisfied. I don't continue to keep eating. That's just...
That's gluttony. That's gluttony. When something is good and you just got to have another bite. Do we all do that? Not Paris doesn't.
You enjoy your business.
No, it's the excess.
Right.
So it's the feelings of excess here. And if you think back and you go back to those, and again, this is incontinence, right? So this is a lack of control of those desires. This one just simply has to be food and drink. This sin is the opposite of their, this punishment is the opposite of their sin. So they enjoyed food and drink to excess during life. Well, in circle 3, they actually have an excess of torment. So there's this muddy rain, hail, what else is there? Snow. And all of this creates this muck that they have to live in, or not live in, exist in. And so their punishment then is appropriate with contrapasso because it is the opposite of. So if you think how much they enjoyed something and then receiving that much of the opposite, can you keep on? And I think that goes to your question, how do you continue? And it,
Well, in that case, at that time, you got no choice anyway.
you have no choice. It's too late. It's over. It's too late. So when we look here, I want to pay attention and point out the different circles where there are gods or guards. One of the gatekeepers is Cerberus, and he's like this huge 3-headed dog, and he's biting and salivating, and he's got claws, and he's guarding. He's guarding to keep the living from coming down. So he is very attentive to Dante and questions them about what they're doing, but it's also to keep the dead in. As he questions, Virgil actually picks up some of the muck and throws it in his mouth to silence him. So we say something very small, and we think, how are you going to get around a 3-headed dog? And it's just a little bit of sand or a little bit of muck.
Guards, do they have to suffer as well? They have to
think they're suffering. Well, Marcus, I don't know. Maybe that's their punishment in some way. I'd have to do some research on that.
I don't know, they might be enjoying it too.
Their reward?
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and research that. I don't know, but I can find out.
It sounds like the dog has to sit through all that stuff too, all the time.
Like, how did they figure out who was going to get it? Like, were they punished down there? And
I think
then
it's the same way God picked his angels, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're just the first of the first down there now.
Yeah, do they get a rest or a break?
They don't get a break. It's eternal. Day after day. Or I don't know that there's day after day.
Like suffering too.
I don't disagree. But I will I can research that and find out. We see, let's see, what page are we on? Page 1618. If you'll turn to there, kind of goes on in. But,
I do have a question.
yes ma'am.
Like doing the Odyssey and the Gallon and Green Knight, when they were having peace, would that not be considered gluttony?
Yes.
Because they weren't eating to eat. They were like having feast, celebrating.
So I think the key word there is celebration. I think gluttony implies that it is a repeated behavior day in and day out.
So more like a drunk.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Or an addiction. Yeah, because it's incontinence.
so
You
if it's
can't.
moderation, it's okay.
What's that?
If it's in moderation, it's okay.
Then it's not gluttony, because gluttony is excess. So
Okay.
it's like I overeat on holidays, right? And if there's cheesecake, I'm going to overeat. It's just what I do. And then I'm like, ugh. And then you get back on track. I think with gluttons, there's never a getting back on track. It's just more and more and more in excess.
Man, like I said, celebration night. But they just have a celebration almost like every night, right?
Or a compulsion. It's incontinence. They don't have control over it. Who said addiction? I think that's a good word to use. There's a lack of control. Yeah.
I mean, technically they could have all that food, but if they don't eat excessively, then that'd be okay.
Yes. So it's the consumption. And that's what we see with the sins of incontinence. It's all this consumption, right? Over and over and over. Alrighty. He sees a person from Florence, and he recognizes him, and he actually calls to him. Now, Chiaco, lines 62 through 75, actually gives a prophecy for Florence. Now remember, Dante is a true patriot. He is a citizen, and he loves his city. And these were city-states during the time. And so he listens to that and his heart broken, because the prophecy is there are these two warring families, and while there are good men, both from each side, who can come to agreement, nobody listens to them. They are ignored. So the city stays in this type of strife. All right. So there's a redeeming characteristic here for Chiaco in that. This goes to, and it's at the very bottom, and I hope you can see it, the power of literature. Now, we call this the literary present tense because every time somebody reads the Inferno and they read this, not only is he remembered for the gluttony, but he's remembered to be a good citizen of the city. So it's not that they were all bad, these were their weaknesses. So the literary present, the power of literature, and we see that a few more times throughout the Inferno, where characteristics are restored, and we remember good parts of them, not just what we see as their punishment, which is difficult to do sometimes, I think. Y'all help me out on time, okay? Sins of incontinence continue. We are down to circle 4. These are the prodigal and the miserly. And these pictures actually came from those walls. I don't know if that was another literature class or if that's an art class, but I took these and this one. So circle 4 is the prodigal and the miserly. So if we go back to the prodigal son, right, he's wasteful. He spends everything. So that's prodigal. Miserly are those hermits, every little dime that they can inch out, that they can save, to a point where they don't live comfortably. That's a true miser. So their sin is to push these huge boulders just back and forth to each other. So one's on one side, one's on the other, and all they're doing is just pushing back and forth and screaming at each other. And they scream waste, and then hoard. And then they just push. And they do that for eternity. Think about during the Holocaust, one of the punishments that the concentration camps the Nazis would actually do is just to move huge blocks from one part of the camp to another part of the camp. And then the next day, they moved them back. And then the next day, they moved them to the other side again. And it was just the futility of it. There's no point, right? But these two continue to just push against, because they were on such opposing ends, then they oppose each other for eternity in hell.
That's all they can say to each other?
I think they scream other things, but those were the two that described, their characteristic. But they're like, all the time. They're not chatting. Mm-mm. No, they hate each other. They don't understand each other. And remember, prejudice and ignorance is usually based on a lack of understanding. Okay, circle 5, I'm speeding up. The wrathful and the sullen. This is page 1623. We get to another river, the river Styx. Now the 4 rivers kind of play a prominent point, and I think it was maybe it's the first canto of next week, but we see the old man of Crete, and he actually is the source for all of the rivers in the Inferno, for all of the rivers in hell. Now Styx is one of the most famous because it's in so much of Greek and Roman literature or stories that we see, myths that we see. The angry, they actually literally tear each other apart, just as they kind of tore families apart in life. So they're literally biting, clawing, ripping, for eternity. The sullen are called different things. If you do any research or do anything else, they're also called the sluggish. And because of that, they literally, because they're so sluggish, they're so sullen, they gurgle. It's this bubbling sound of this muck and mud that's in their mouths because they didn't voice themselves. They didn't get up and go. So it's just this churning about them. Which would you consider the worst so far?
The boulders.
Boulders?
That was kind of
They're gurgling mud.
Yeah, that's a raining feces and all of
That's
that.
pretty bad too.
Pass on that.
I'm gonna go with that one.
I'm gonna push a rock. I'll push a rock before you go. But does the rock move, or they just?
Oh yeah, the rocks are moving. Yeah, sometimes this one's pushing, then sometimes this one gets the better hand, and then sometimes they go again. Yeah, it's just a constant back and
I
forth.
thought they were both pitching on the orbital and nowhere.
Yeah, they move. They get the upper hand of each other.
I don't know, the boiling blood sounds pretty bad too.
That's up to your eyeballs. I don't know, the gurgling of mud in my mouth, I don't think I'd like that either.
It's hard to keep water in your mouth for like a few minutes before you're like, okay, I have to swallow it.
That's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good thought. It would be hard. Yeah. Everything about this is hard, right? None of it's easy. It's to keep you on the path to God. Keep that in mind. Did a good job. I'm telling you, after I read the Inferno, I'm good for a long time. Real good. Sins of incontinence still continue into circle 5. We see another steersman, so on the river. This one, Flavius is angry with Dante. He doesn't want him to continue, but he allows him to because Virgil says you have to. All right, so Virgil again sets down these gatekeepers one after the other. A shade approaches him. Let's see, I don't know if that's 1624.
I have a question.
1625. Yes, sir.
Why doesn't it say he just confront both of them? I think there is a way to stop it.
Satan can't come up.
No, part of it.
So, now remember, this is Dante's vision, right? That he's frozen in the river. He can't.
Does he play a part in the second part we're going to read?
Purgatory.
Or the second part of the Inferno, is he going to play a part?
Oh yeah, we get to the devil. Yep. Let's see, anything here? Lines 37 through 39. He recognizes someone from Florence as his political enemy, and he tells us that he has no good qualities to remember him by. He makes him angry, and he wants nothing to do with him. All right. Then, as he's here, these other bodies come running by, and they literally just start taking all of these big chunks out of him. All right. What's that? They did. They tore him up. I'm going to add that to my notes, Paris. Let's see. Circle 5. Now, this is where we get into Virgil as teacher again. He actually commends Dante's scorn. Because now remember, Dante has throughout felt pity for, to the point being that he's moved to tears, that he weeps for the shades that he sees. Here, it's nothing. In other places, he actually stomps on them, right? But so here, he has nothing. And Virgil says, you should feel that way. He deserves your scorn, which is a pretty huge statement coming from that teacher. We continue on down, and I think this is very much toward the end. Page 1626, if you just want to add, I'm going to add that here, because I'll post it, and that'll give you a point of reference. But they travel to the actual city of Dis. Now, when they get there, this is what is really crazy. Virgil has had power throughout, right? He has been able to get through each of the gatekeepers at the city of Dis, and Flavius, steers them across the river. He allows them to cross on over. The angels who are guarding the city, they're sitting up on top of these big towers, they won't let them in. And Virgil tells them, he says, I'm supposed to. I've been given this decree from a higher power, and y'all are supposed to let me in. And the angels say, no, not going to do it. And they don't. Now, that's where, I hope I wrote it down. Yes, the next canto. So, I might have come on this. Page 1627, and I combined these two cantos. Virgil, it's the first time he hasn't been successful, right? Now, Dante's been gaining some courage. He's been gaining some bravery. He's even spoken to a few shades all by himself without encouragement, actually being curious and walking up to them. Dante is going, uh-oh. He loses some faith in Virgil, and he becomes frightened again. He truly wavers. And I did that wave because, that's like swinging back and forth. And he contemplates escaping, of trying to get back up, because he's lost some faith in Virgil. He questions Virgil. Has anybody ever gone this far into hell? So this is where he's thinking, right? And can I get back out? And this is where we see where Virgil actually says yes. before. He tells them a story, a couple of different people that he's led down, and that he can lead him down, and that he will exit on the other side of the Inferno, which then is purgatory. Right, so he kind of reinstills that confidence. We see a couple of things through here. He sends a message to Paradiso, and another angel finally descends. And the angel descends, and he tells the other angels to unlock those city gates, and then he actually scolds the angels. So those lines 79 through 105 are actually really good lines. So let me highlight those. I really do want you to go back and read these, because we kind of think about sometimes, if they're in hell, those angels were kicked out for a reason, right? But even in hell, they have a purpose. And when Virgil comes through and he says, I've been given this edict from above, you're supposed to, and they don't, and they're not fulfilling, their responsibilities in opening up the city. So they finally do. As they go in, we see the heretics. Now this is one where Farinata actually sits up from out of the tomb. Now the coffins or the tombs are stone, but they're glowing. They're so hot red. And they're in a bed of like fires. Fires are popping up all around them. So we see the heretics as the ones who literally burn in hell. When you think about that phrase, that's what they are. Now he speaks to Dante. He talks directly to him. One thing that's interesting about this one, as opposed to like Ciotto, who also gives a prophecy, is that he sees the future, but he can't see the present. I don't know if I don't know that I actually recorded that, but he literally can't. Oh, here it is. It's on page 1633, and it's line 99, and he says, I beg you to resolve a problem that has kept my reason tangled in a knot. If I've heard correctly, all of you can see ahead to what the future holds, but your knowledge of the present is not clear. He responds, down here we see like those with faulty vision who only see what's at a distance. This much the sovereign Lord grants us here. So as we think about different people who come down, and there's not many, but they do kind of get this advice, and these people are kind of like sages, that the advice they give or the prophecies they tell are helpful to the living soul that's traveling through. So it's odd. It's like an oxymoron. You don't expect that. Here we have all of the traders of Florence, who specifically Dante is going to despise because he is that city statesman. There's a word of warning too. Virgil, he's been teaching throughout, but as a completely side item, it doesn't make any sense. It's out of context. It's out of the blue. But he warns Dante that when he makes it out, when he makes it to purgatory, and he is met by Beatrice, that he has to listen to her. Now, from above, it's talked about vision, and we don't see clearly sometimes, but think about at times when people have told you something, but you did not listen. You went on your own path that you had chosen without considering what they had said. That's kind of the implication here. So we have both vision and the auditory, so seeing and hearing. And I think, again, paying attention. Because remember, he has strayed from the path of God simply because he wasn't paying attention. He wasn't paying attention to how he was living. I'm going to speed up, I promise. We're still in the sixth circle in Canto 11. This gets a little weird. Virgil teaches Dante about the next three circles. It's preparation. So they're so horrific. They need prepping. And that's what they stand for. It also is very important because it solidifies that teacher-student relationship between the two. He tells them of Circle 7 that this is violence, and there are 3 rounds or 3 rings. And you'll see sometimes, no, that's a different one. They're called pouches. But these are violence against God, the self, which is suicide, and then others. So for Francesca's husband at the very beginning, who were the sins of lust, so her husband would be here because he committed violence against her and his brother. Circle 8 is for, typo, y'all let me know if y'all see typos, is for the flatterers, the hypocrites, the dabblers in sorcery. I love that, and I took this straight from it. Falsifiers, thieves, and then the Simonists. Now the Simonists are defined as they sold, these were all clerics, right? So these were what we would consider ministers, men of God, but they sold spiritual goods. So they, remember like Ciparillo? Like, let's say he really wasn't on that false confession, but he would have to pay a priest to give him last rites. That would have been an example of simony. Yes?
It says hypocrites, is that like just, like, is that super strict, or is it kind of, because like Christians, if you say you're a Christian, like you have to technically be perfect like Jesus, or else if you make...
Or you repent.
Okay.
It doesn't mean without sin. You sin, but you ask forgiveness.
Yeah, but like technically to someone outside of Christianity, they'd be like, they saw you sin, to them you're a hypocrite.
Yes.
But to you, if you repent, you're okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I've always said. I need to switch to Catholicism because, you know, like it, you know, with Christianity, with Baptist, Methodist, and all of us, we don't really. There's not a sense of complete relief. I mean, you pray, you ask for forgiveness, and some people really feel it, but there's this huge component of guilt, right, that we live with. But if you truly have asked and you feel forgiven, then the guilt should float away. Christian constructs. Okay. We have another Minotaur. The Minotaur here is another gatekeeper. This is where we get into the river of blood. It boils the souls for eternity. And again, we're talking about contrapasso here. The worse their sin, the deeper they are in the boiling river of blood. Now for those who try to escape, we've got a few people here, those who try to escape, the centaurs are there to shoot them with arrows. So not only are they boiling in blood, but now they've got arrows all through them too. So there's just more punishment. Another famous character, Nessus, actually helps them cross this river. So what's interesting throughout is there's always help. You know, they receive assistance, whether they have to or not, it is given. The next round, or the next ring in Circle 7, is the sins against the self, the suicides. This one in Contrapasso stands out. When it talks about the second coming, and all of the souls, the shades, will be reunited with their bodies, the suicides is the only group that is not allowed that. And the thought, Dante's thought behind this is that they treated their own bodies so savagely, they threw it away, that they don't deserve to be reunited with their body. So they remain the trees, they remain the bushes, and then the body simply hangs on those branches as a reminder of their sin. So when we think about unforgiven sins, It seems to be suicide is it. It's the one where the body doesn't get to connect back.
Big thing in trees, easier oil and whatever.
Oh, but here's the thing. You break, the branches break and then different things pull off the leaves, and each one of those is painful, and then everything has to be brought back together to keep everything intact. So you're constantly worrying, so to speak. The trees are also fed on by the harpies, and the harpies are the birds, and they tend to be they're female. They have women's faces, they have bird bodies, and then they have these claws. So they're constantly clawing and feeding off of the trees. So there's punishment within just that. One thing that's really weird about this circle, there's two people that run through, and it doesn't make sense. If they're suicides, if they're in the circle, if they're in the round, then they should be trees. And if they're not suicides and they're bodies, then what are they doing in the circle? It's one of those unanswered questions. Read this one carefully and see if you have a good reason for it, because I've read this literally for 25 years. For the life of me, I can't figure that part out. So kind of a contradiction. He talks to one man who commits suicide even though he was innocent. And so an accusation is made, the entire town believes it, and he can't live with it. The burden becomes too heavy. It's just like a rumor that gets started now. I mean, I teach high school, and social media harassment and bullying is ever present. And so we're constantly monitoring social media, because the difference between when I was in school and now is that, when I was in school, you could go home and you were in a cocoon, you were safe. You had one phone in the kitchen. And so you escaped all of that. Whereas now, they go right into your phone and bombard. We're done? Okay. I think y'all can. I just summed these up because I knew I would be getting to this point. Round 3, these are the blasphemers. This is the burning sand. King Capaneus is here. The old man of Crete. Read that. This one is very important, and we'll actually go back to it as well. But read this one and we'll discuss it next week. The last circle, or the last round in circle 7, is the sodomite. And he actually encounters another one from Florence and reconnects with him, and then we see another positive side to this man who kind of lives on, so he's not just remembered for that. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in that one. So next time we look at the remainder of the cantos. And I won't go into so much detail as I did here. I just wanted you to be able to truly see the level of development that Dante goes through. Now the discussion, I have it up to be due for next, whenever it's supposed to be due. Is it Thursday night, Friday night? Friday night. So I'll change that to the Friday of spring break. So if you want to submit it, you can go ahead and do it. I'll send out a reminder, for the post for the others. I just don't want to push the discussion another week after that. So then week 10 we won't have one. We won't have a second discussion for Inferno. Right.
So will the discussion be on the parts we read, or just?
I'll have to go back and revisit that. I'll make it just on the first part, this week's reading, because you wouldn't have gotten that instruction. After the part 2, after the second half, and it's about the same, it's about 50 pages, it's still dense reading, then there is the test on Middle Ages. And so we'll discuss that next time that we meet. Next week is spring break, so I got that confused, so don't show up. Questions, comments, concerns?
Is that outline online?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll make sure that it's active, but yes. And it's not in depth, but it'll give you that starting point. And I'll give you the essay questions next week when we meet, next time we meet.
So we can do this week's discussion either this Friday or the Friday we return.
The Friday before. Next week, Friday of spring
So I
break.
can do it this Friday
Or next.
during spring break.
And then that way everything will be ready when we come back. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys. Y'all have a great week. Have a good spring break.
Thank you.
I'm not looking forward to that. Oh, I was going to make copies. Does anyone want this outline? Do anybody needs it? It's online, but it said that it didn't print easily. Okay. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, I'll bring copies next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a good one. So this is what I'm excited copy. Do you want? I can go copy. Yeah. Okay. I'll be right back. I mean, it'll take me 3 minutes. It's just down the hall.
I'll be in the ER, but I'll be over there. And we're not busy after order. Yeah, and we'll be there. My grandma. I'm actually gonna be there in this bird.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so we'll be, because he's actually, doing a clinical, he's one of the clinical instructors this summer. Yeah, so he will be with Miss Bird tomorrow during the day, just kind of follow her around, see how she does things. And then, he works every Saturday, Sunday, Monday, during the day. Oh, so you'll see him. And he'll help you with it. He's really smart too. So, somebody else will be.
Okay.